In the past few decades, divers have exploded in popularity and they now dominate the wrist of millions of watch wearers. And with this being the case, there's a lot of options to choose from in the marketplace. But a lot of the options tend to be uninspired as they follow the rotatable bezel formula set in place by brands like Rolex and Blancpain. This is where I feel that the JLC shines with their offering of the Polaris. The Polaris is by no means the most sophisticated watch out there, but I feel like they offer value elsewhere with their attention to detail and their retro-inspired design. The blue dial of this Polaris is easily one of the more interesting ones I've seen, as it has a beautiful multi-dimensional finish to it that is hard to find on other watches. The center dial is sunburst, while the middle layer has a textured finish to it that looks very sophisticated. The outer layer, or the inner dive bezel, has this shiny matte finish to it that provides excellent contrast to the mid layer. The indices are applied, and they play beautifully with light. The dial has great depth, and it is beautiful to appreciate. The Polaris draws back its heritage to the Memovox Polaris, which was released in the 1960s. The Memovox Polaris came with an alarm function to provide a more acute sense of time while the user was diving underwater. This was a unique approach to dive watches compared to the competition such as Rolex. Needless to say, the design language of the Polaris feels vintage inspired, but in a day of age where most dive watches draw design from the Rolex school of thought, it's very refreshing to see something different. And I'll be upfront and say, if you're looking to utilize every meter of the depth rating, this Polaris is probably not for you. The Polaris may not have the beefiest of specs, but for 99% of the population that wear divers nowadays, we're all mostly desk divers. We all wear it into an office setting or some sort of cordial setting. So for majority of us, the Polaris will fit just fine. And speaking of specs, the Polaris has 10 bar of water resistance and has applied indices with lume on all of its dial markers. 10 bar of water resistance is more than enough for you to be able to swim in them, but I wouldn't risk taking it for actual diving, as there are more hardcore divers that can serve as a better alternative. The bezel is turned by the crown at the 2 o'clock position. It is bi-directional, so you can turn it both clockwise and counterclockwise. The lume is decent, but nothing to boast compared to other watch brands like Seiko or Rolex. Housed inside the watch's case is the in-house JLC caliber 898/1. It's an automatic movement that beats at 4 Hz and has a mediocre 40-hour power reserve. And for me personally, the accuracy has came in between -2 to +1 seconds over the past few months, so it's rather excellent in the accuracy department. There is an exhibition case back, and it is rather nicely decorated with Côtes de Genève and heated blue screws. And it also has a rotor with a nicely done dark rhodium treatment. Admittedly, the power reserve is disappointing for modern day standards, but the finishing of the movement is superb and the quality control is excellent, with every JLC watch being tested for 1,000 hours during the first 6 weeks after the watch was manufactured. Speaking of quality, the case finishing is more sophisticated than other watches in its price tier, such as Rolex. The sides and lugs are satin finished, with beveling coming down to the sides of the lugs. Looking into the back of the case, there's beveling on the undersides of the lugs, which are hand finished by trained artisans. Unlike brands like Rolex and Omega that use an industrialized method of production, there's a decent level hand finishing that goes into the case and movement construction of the JLC, with the human element having a positive correlation to the price of the particular JLC model in question. If I had to compare the case finishing of the Polaris to other brands in a similar price tier, I would say it ranks above brands like Omega and Rolex, while below brands like Grand Seiko, which really isn't much of an insult considering that finishing is Grand Seiko's strongest suit, besides maybe their dials. But now let's move on to dimensions. The Polaris has a diameter of 41mm, a thickness of 11.2mm, lug-to-lug length of 47.5mm, and a lug width of 21mm. This watch actually wears similar to 40mm watches due to its pretty compact lug-to-lug distance. but it gives off a larger presence on your wrist due to the larger dial to bezel ratio. My wrist size is 7.1 inches, and I would recommend this watch to anyone with a wrist size of 6 inches or higher. Furthermore, at face value, the 21mm lug width may seem problematic, as most of us are pretty sick and tired of seeing odd number lug widths on watches, but there are many strap makers that sell 21mm size straps, so if you're one of those guys that like customizing your watches with aftermarket straps, don't sweat it. There are many options for you. I have mine on an aftermarket straps from the lugs, and I think the tan color of the strap pairs really well with the blue dial. JLC also sells OEM rubber straps as well as a bracelet. So if you want to stick to OEM, you have options as well. Just take it into consideration that OEM straps naturally tend to be more pricey. In terms of alternatives to the Polaris model, besides the base blue, there is a base black. There are also the Polaris date models in green, blue, and black. If you want more complications, don't sweat it. There are also Polaris models with a chronograph, world time, and a perpetual calendar. So there's something for everybody. In conclusion, the Polaris doesn't have the beefiest of specs, coming in with an underwhelming water resistance rating and a minimal power reserve, but it makes up for all of that and more with its intricate blue dial and its outstanding level of quality and quality control. Also, the Polaris is pretty distinct from other dive watches out there, so it can be a real conversation starter, especially with its heritage tying back to the Memovox Polaris from the 1960s. And I believe this reference of the Polaris is perfect for anyone who doesn't want to follow the mainstream. Even with its lower than standard specs for a diver, it's still more than enough to be able to accompany you in your adventures, whether that's in the mountains or in your work office. And with that said, I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts in this retro-inspired diver design? Is it refreshing to see more of these in the market, or do you guys still prefer the mainstream rotatable bezel style of divers? I'd love to know. Anyways, that is all for today. Thank you guys so much for making it to the end. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Take care.